The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the tall buildings of downtown Atlanta when Destiny Williams hurried down the quiet street, her backpack bouncing against her back with each quick step. At 17, she had mastered the art of being the perfect early bird, a skill she developed over the past year of working the morning shift at Sweet Bean Coffee Shop before heading to school. The fresh autumn air nipped at her cheeks as she pulled her cozy purple sweater closer. Her mom had always told her that responsibility would open doors, and here she was, trusted with the keys to one of the busiest coffee shops in the upscale neighborhood. The weight of those keys in her pocket reminded her of how far she'd come since asking for this job last year. As Destiny rounded the corner to the shop's entrance, something unusual caught her eye. There, huddled in the corner of the building, was an elderly woman she had never seen before. The woman's clothes were worn but clean, and despite sitting on the ground, she maintained a dignified posture that seemed strangely out of place for someone who appeared to be homeless. Destiny hesitated for a moment, remembering her manager Mr. Chen's strict policy about asking homeless people to leave the premises before customers arrived. "It's bad for business," he always said with a sympathetic but firm tone. But something about this woman was different. Maybe it was the way she held a tattered copy of what looked like a classic novel, or how she quietly nodded good morning to Destiny without asking for anything. Inside the shop, Destiny went through her opening routine, firing up the espresso machines, checking the pastry deliveries, and setting up the counter. But her mind kept wandering to the woman outside. Through the window, she could see her gently turning the pages of her book, completely absorbed in her reading despite the growing morning chill. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as Destiny prepared for the morning rush. She found herself making an extra cup of dark roast, the kind that seemed fitting for someone who read classics at dawn. Her hands moved automatically, adding just a touch of cream, the way her grandmother used to drink it. Mr. Chen wouldn't arrive for another hour, and the morning regulars wouldn't start trickling in for at least 30 minutes. Destiny looked at the coffee in her hands, then at the security camera in the corner. What she was about to do might get her in trouble, but her heart told her it was right. Opening the door carefully, balancing the coffee and a warm blueberry muffin she'd picked from the fresh batch, Destiny stepped outside. The woman looked up, and their eyes met. There was something in those eyes, wisdom, warmth, and a hint of surprise at being approached with kindness rather than suspicion. "Good morning," Destiny said softly, extending the coffee and muffin. "I thought you might like something warm. It's getting chilly out here." The woman's face lit up with a gentle smile that seemed to erase years from her weathered features. "That's very kind of you, dear," she responded in a voice that carried the soft lilt of old Southern grace. Her words were clear and well-chosen, not at all what Destiny had expected. "I'm Destiny," she offered, noticing the book in the woman's hands was Pride and Prejudice, its spine cracked and pages dog-eared from countless readings. "You can call me Miss Eleanor," the woman replied, accepting the coffee with hands that, despite their roughness, moved with an elegant grace. "You know, in all my time out here, you're the first person who's offered me coffee instead of just spare change." There was something about the way Ms. Eleanor spoke, educated, refined, that made Destiny even more curious. Before she could stop herself, she asked, "Do you enjoy Jane Austen?" Ms. Eleanor's eyes sparkled. "Oh my, you recognized it. Not many young people these days would." She patted the space beside her, and despite every warning she'd ever heard about talking to strangers, Destiny found herself sitting down on the clean piece of cardboard Ms. Eleanor had laid out. The early morning light grew stronger as they sat there, an unlikely pair sharing a conversation about literature that would change both their lives forever. Destiny didn't know it yet, but this simple act of kindness, this decision to see the person behind the circumstances, was about to set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not only her future, but the way their entire community thought about homelessness and human dignity. That first morning conversation with Ms. Eleanor kept playing in Destiny's mind throughout her school day. She couldn't shake the image of those intelligent eyes and well-spoken words that seemed so at odds with the cardboard seat and worn clothes. During her history class, while other students dozed off to their teacher's lecture about the Civil War, Destiny found herself wondering about Ms. Eleanor's story. The next morning, Destiny arrived at work 15 minutes earlier than usual. Her heart sank a little when she didn't see Ms. Eleanor in her usual spot. Maybe yesterday had been a one-time thing, she thought, trying not to feel disappointed as she unlocked the coffee shop's door. But just as she was setting up the pastry display, she caught a glimpse of movement outside. Ms. Eleanor was making her way down the street, clutching her worn bag and what looked like a different book. This time, Destiny didn't hesitate. She prepared 2 cups of coffee and grabbed a couple of warm breakfast sandwiches that had just been delivered. Mr. Chen always let the staff have 1 free breakfast item during their shift, and today she'd use hers for Ms. Eleanor. "I was hoping you'd be here," Destiny said, stepping outside during her break. The morning air was crisp, and the street was still quiet except for the distant rumble of early traffic. Ms. Eleanor looked up from her book, Jane Eyre this time, and her face brightened. "Well, if it isn't my literary friend," she said warmly, accepting the coffee and sandwich with graceful hands. "You know, you don't have to do this." "I want to," Destiny replied, settling down beside her. "Besides, it's nice to talk to someone who loves books as much as I do. None of my friends understand why I'd rather read than scroll through social media all day." Ms. Eleanor chuckled, a sound that reminded Destiny of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "In my experience, books are much better company than phones. They don't run out of battery, and they never judge you for spending hours with them." As they ate their sandwiches, Ms. Eleanor surprised Destiny by asking about her favorite books, not in the way adults usually did, with that condescending tone that suggested young people didn't read real literature anymore. Instead, she listened intently as Destiny talked about loving everything from classic novels to modern poetry. "You remind me of my students," Ms. Eleanor said softly, then quickly looked away, as if she'd revealed something she hadn't meant to. "You were a teacher?" Destiny asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite her growing curiosity. Ms. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her book. "I was many things," she finally said. "A professor, actually. Literature was my life for over 30 years. Destiny nearly choked on her coffee. "A professor? Living on the streets?" Her mind raced with questions, but something in Ms. Eleanor's expression told her not to push too hard, not yet. Instead, they talked about Charlotte Bronte and her sisters, about the way Jane Eyre challenged the social norms of its time. Ms. Eleanor's eyes lit up as she spoke, her hands moving expressively as she explained the historical context of the novel. For those moments, she wasn't a homeless woman sitting on cardboard. She was a passionate educator sharing her life's work. The conversation flowed so naturally that Destiny almost forgot about the time until her phone buzzed with her break time alarm. "I have to get back to work," she said reluctantly, standing up and brushing off her jeans. "Thank you, dear," Ms. Eleanor said, and Destiny knew she wasn't just talking about the coffee and sandwich. It's been a long time since I've had such a lovely discussion about literature." As Destiny headed back inside, she heard Ms. Eleanor quietly say, "Perhaps tomorrow we could talk about the Romantic poets." The hope in her voice made Destiny's heart squeeze. "I'd like that," Destiny replied, already making mental notes to brush up on her Wordsworth and Coleridge during lunch break at school. Throughout her shift, Destiny kept glancing out the window at Ms. Eleanor, who was completely absorbed in her book again. Other customers walked past, some giving the homeless woman disapproving looks, others pretending not to see her at all. But Destiny saw something different now. She saw a mystery, a story waiting to be told, a person who had somehow fallen through the cracks of society but still clung to the beauty of literature like a lifeline. Little did she know, these morning conversations were just the beginning of a connection that would grow deeper and more meaningful than either of them could imagine. Sometimes the most profound relationships start with something as simple as a shared love of books and a cup of coffee offered with kindness. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Destiny would arrive early at Sweet Bean Coffee Shop, her backpack now carrying not just school books, but also some poetry collections she'd borrowed from the library. She kept them carefully wrapped in plastic bags, protecting them from the morning dew that often gathered on the cardboard where she and Ms. Eleanor sat. One particularly chilly morning, Destiny found Ms. Eleanor rubbing her hands together for warmth. Without thinking twice, she unwrapped her own scarf, a soft, blue one her grandmother had knitted, and gently placed it around Ms. Eleanor's shoulders. "Oh, no, dear, I couldn't possibly," Ms. Eleanor protested, trying to return it. "Please keep it," Destiny insisted. My grandma always made too many anyway. She didn't mention that it was actually her favorite scarf, or that her grandmother had passed away last year. Something told her Miss Eleanor needed it more than she did. Their morning talks had become the highlight of Destiny's day. They'd discuss everything from ancient Greek tragedies to modern poetry, but it was the small moments between literary discussions that really touched her heart. Like when Miss Eleanor would unconsciously straighten her worn clothes before their talks, maintaining a dignity that life on the streets couldn't take away. Or how she'd save interesting newspaper articles she found to share with Destiny, always handling the crumpled papers with care, as if they were precious gifts. "You remind me so much of my best student," Ms. Eleanor said one morning after Destiny shared her interpretation of a particularly complex poem. She had that same spark in her eyes when she talked about literature. "What happened to her?" Destiny asked carefully, noticing how Ms. Eleanor always spoke of her past in brief, guarded fragments. A shadow passed over Ms. Eleanor's face. "She's probably teaching somewhere now, making a difference, I hope." She paused, fiddling with the corner of her book. "I lost touch with everyone after things changed." Destiny wanted to ask more but held back. Instead, she shared her own dreams. "I want to go to college so badly," she admitted, pulling out a crumpled letter from her bag. "I got early acceptance to State University, but even with a partial scholarship, we can't afford it. Mom works 2 jobs already, and my part-time work here barely covers our groceries." Ms. Eleanor listened with such genuine concern that Destiny found herself opening up more than she had with anyone else. She talked about her younger siblings, about helping them with homework while their mom worked late, about staying up after everyone was asleep to study because it was the only quiet time she could find. "You know," Ms. Eleanor said softly, "education was my life's work. I still believe, that it's the key to transforming lives." She stopped suddenly, as if she'd said too much, and changed the subject to discuss Wordsworth's view of nature. Some mornings, Destiny would arrive to find Miss Eleanor already deep in conversation with other homeless people who'd started gathering nearby. She spoke to them with the same respect and dignity she showed everyone, often sharing her food and coffee with those who needed it more. "Everyone has a story," she told Destiny once, after an elderly man had stopped by to share half a sandwich with her. "That man used to be a jazz musician, played in all the big clubs downtown. Life can change so fast, dear. One moment you're on top of the world, and the next..." She trailed off, lost in thoughts she wasn't ready to share. One rainy morning, Destiny spotted Ms. Eleanor trying to protect her books with a torn plastic sheet. That afternoon, she spent her lunch break at school researching local shelters and support services. But when she gently brought up the topic, Ms. Eleanor just smiled sadly. "Sometimes, dear, the safest place is the one you choose for yourself," she said cryptically, "even if others don't understand why." Despite her curiosity, Destiny never pushed too hard for answers. She understood that trust, like the best stories, needed time to unfold. Instead, she focused on the present, bringing an extra umbrella on rainy days, sharing her lunch when she could, and most importantly, treating Ms. Eleanor with the respect she deserved. What amazed Destiny most was how Ms. Eleanor never complained about her situation. Even on the coldest mornings, she'd find something positive to discuss. The way the sunrise painted the sky, the kindness of a stranger who'd given her a warm cup of tea, or the joy of finding a new book someone had left on a park bench. Their morning talks had become more than just discussions about literature. They were lessons in resilience, dignity, and the power of human connection. Destiny couldn't help but feel that she was learning more from these dawn conversations than she ever had in a classroom. But life has a way of changing when you least expect it, and neither of them knew that their comfortable routine was about to be dramatically disrupted. Sometimes the greatest challenges come just when you think you've figured things out, and the true test of friendship isn't in the easy moments, but in the storms that follow. The morning everything changed started like any other. The air was unusually crisp, with winter making an early appearance in Atlanta. Destiny hurried down the street, her breath making little clouds in the cold air. She'd brought an extra thermos of hot soup today, the kind her mom made when anyone in the family was feeling under the weather. Ms. Eleanor had been coughing a lot lately, and Destiny couldn't shake her worry. But when she reached their usual spot, her heart stopped. Ms. Eleanor was there, but something was terribly wrong. Instead of sitting with her usual straight posture, she was slumped against the wall, her beloved copy of Pride and Prejudice lying open and face down beside her. "Miss Eleanor." Destiny dropped her backpack and rushed over. "Miss Eleanor, can you hear me?" The older woman's skin felt hot to the touch, despite the cold morning air. Her breathing was shallow and raspy, and when she opened her eyes, they were glassy with fever. "Destiny," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, dear. I don't think I'm up for poetry discussions today." Without hesitation, Destiny pulled out her phone to call 911. Her hands were shaking, but her voice remained steady as she gave the operator their location. Years of helping care for her younger siblings during their sick days had taught her to stay calm in emergencies. "No hospitals," Ms. Eleanor protested weakly, trying to push herself up. "I can't. I don't have." "Please," Destiny said firmly, holding her hand. "You're really sick. You need help." Mr. Chen came running out of the coffee shop, having seen the commotion through the window. "Destiny? What's going on?" "I told you not to." "Mr. Chen, please," Destiny interrupted, her eyes filling with tears. "She's really sick. She needs help. I know I might lose my job over this, but I can't just leave her here." Her boss's face softened as he looked at Ms. Eleanor's condition. Without a word, he hurried back into the shop and returned with a clean blanket they kept for emergencies. Together, they wrapped it around Ms. Eleanor's shivering form. The ambulance arrived with its sirens wailing, cutting through the quiet morning. A small crowd had gathered, including some of the regular customers who'd passed Ms. Eleanor every day without a second glance. Now they watched with concern as the paramedics carefully lifted her onto the stretcher. "I'm going with her," Destiny announced, already climbing into the ambulance. When one of the paramedics started to object, she added quickly, "I'm the only person she knows. Please." During the ride to the hospital, Destiny held Ms. Eleanor's hand while the paramedics worked. They asked questions she couldn't answer: medical history, existing conditions, emergency contacts. But when they needed a name for their forms, Ms. Eleanor surprised everyone by speaking up clearly, despite her fever. "Dr. Eleanor Richardson," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "Former Dean of Literature at Berkeley University." Destiny's jaw dropped. She knew Ms. Eleanor had been a professor, but a dean at one of the country's top universities. Her mind raced with questions, but now wasn't the time. At the hospital, everything happened in a blur. Doctors diagnosed severe pneumonia, complicated by prolonged exposure to cold weather and malnutrition. While they treated Ms. Eleanor, a kind nurse helped Destiny fill out admission forms. "Next of kin?" the nurse asked gently. Destiny hesitated. I don't know. She never talked about family." But as she sat in the waiting room, something clicked in her memory. Ms. Eleanor's book, it was still at their spot outside the coffee shop. She'd seen her write in it sometimes, using it almost like a journal. Maybe it contained some information about her family. She called Mr. Chen, who had surprisingly offered to hold her job for her, and asked him to look for the book. An hour later, he brought it to the hospital himself, along with a cup of hot chocolate for his most stubborn employee. With trembling hands, Destiny opened the book. On the inside cover, in elegant handwriting, was a list of phone numbers. Most were crossed out, but one caught her eye: University Office, Berkeley. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number. "Hello," she said when someone answered. "My name is Destiny Williams, and I'm calling about Dr. Eleanor Richardson. She's in the hospital and, well, this might sound crazy, but she was your Dean of Literature." The silence on the other end lasted so long that Destiny thought the call had dropped. Then a woman's voice, choked with emotion, responded, "Oh my God, we've been looking for her for 3 years." As Destiny listened to the story that followed, tears rolled down her cheeks. Sometimes the kindness you show to strangers doesn't just change their lives, it helps them find their way back home. But sitting there in the sterile hospital waiting room, she had no idea that this crisis would lead to changes in her own life that she could never have imagined. Within hours of Destiny's phone call, the quiet hospital corridor burst into activity. 2 women arrived from Berkeley University's English department: Dr. Chen, the current department chair, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been Dr. Richardson's secretary for over 20 years. Their faces showed a mix of worry, relief, and lingering disbelief. "We never stopped looking," Mrs. Rodriguez told Destiny, wiping tears from her eyes as they sat in the hospital waiting room. "After Thomas passed away, she just disappeared. Left everything, her house, her car, her life's work. We filed missing persons reports, hired private investigators, but it was like she had vanished into thin air." Destiny listened intently as they shared the story of the brilliant Dr. Eleanor Richardson, whose life had taken such an unexpected turn. 3 years ago, her only son Thomas, a promising young doctor, had died in a car accident while rushing to the hospital for an emergency surgery. He had been her whole world since losing her husband to cancer 15 years earlier. The day after the funeral, she walked into her office, left her keys and phone on the desk, and walked out, Dr. Chen explained softly. "No note, no goodbye. Just gone." The security cameras showed her walking off campus, but after that, she shook her head, still struggling to process finding her mentor and friend living on the streets. A nurse interrupted them to announce that Dr. Richardson was awake and asking for Destiny. Walking into the hospital room, Destiny barely recognized Ms. Eleanor. Clean, with her silver hair neatly combed and wearing a fresh hospital gown, she looked more like the distinguished professor she had once been. But her eyes, they were the same kind, wise eyes that had lit up during their poetry discussions. "I know you an explanation, dear," Ms. Eleanor said, her voice stronger after receiving treatment. She patted the edge of her bed, inviting Destiny to sit. "And an apology for not being honest sooner." "You don't owe me anything," Destiny started, but Ms. Eleanor gently raised her hand to stop her. "After Thomas died," she began, her voice catching slightly, "I couldn't bear to be in my life anymore. Every book in my office reminded me of reading stories to him as a child. Every classroom echoed with memories of him running through the halls while I graded papers. Even my house, his room was exactly as he'd left it that morning." She paused, touching the one copy of Pride and Prejudice that Destiny had brought from the coffee shop. "This was the last birthday gift he gave me. Said every English professor needed a backup copy of their favorite book." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "That day I left my office, I had no plan. I just walked. Walked until my feet hurt, then walked some more. Found myself in a shelter the first night, but I couldn't stand the pitying looks, the well-meaning questions. So I kept walking, city after city, until I ended up here in Atlanta." Destiny reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "But why stay on the streets? You had resources, people who cared about you." "Grief does strange things to a person's mind," Ms. Eleanor replied thoughtfully. "Out there, I could be anonymous. No one knew me as the brilliant professor who couldn't keep her own life together. No one looked at me with those sad eyes, wondering if I was okay. The streets were hard, yes, but the physical discomfort was almost a relief from the emotional pain." She looked at Destiny with tears in her eyes. "But then this remarkable young woman started bringing me coffee. Talked to me about books like I was still somebody worth talking to. Reminded me that there's still beauty in the world, still connections worth making." The door opened quietly as Dr. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez entered. Ms. Eleanor's face showed a mix of emotions, shame, relief, and something like hope. "Welcome back, Dr. Richardson," Dr. Chen said softly, using her professional title like a gentle reminder of who she really was. Ms. Eleanor straightened slightly, as if the weight of her former identity was settling back onto her shoulders. "I'm not sure I can come back," she whispered. "Not to who I was before." "You don't have to be who you were before," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. "But maybe you can be someone new, someone who carries Thomas's memory while still living her own life. He wouldn't have wanted you to disappear." Destiny watched as Ms. Eleanor, Dr. Richardson, absorbed these words. The room fell quiet except for the steady beeping of hospital monitors and the distant sounds of hospital life continuing outside the door. Finally, Ms. Eleanor turned to Destiny. "You know what the hardest part of being on the streets was? Not the cold, not the hunger. It was feeling invisible. People would look right through me, like I didn't exist. Except you. You saw me, really saw me, and in doing so, you helped me start seeing myself again." As the afternoon sun streamed through the hospital window, casting a warm glow over the room, Destiny realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just a person being found, but a life being reclaimed. Sometimes the biggest acts of kindness don't just change one life, they create a ripple effect that touches countless others. And this was just the beginning. The next few weeks brought changes that no one could have predicted. As Dr. Richardson recovered in the hospital, news of her story spread through the university community like wildfire. Former students and colleagues began flooding the hospital with letters, books, and memories of how she had touched their lives. One morning, Destiny arrived at the hospital to find Dr. Richardson sitting up in bed, surrounded by cards and letters. Her eyes were red from crying, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since Destiny had known her. "Listen to this," Dr. Richardson said, holding up a letter. "Dear Dr. Richardson, you probably don't remember me, but I was in your freshman literature class 15 years ago. I was struggling with depression and thinking about dropping out. You noticed something was wrong and invited me to your office. We talked about poetry for hours. You told me that sometimes the darkest chapters of our lives lead to the most beautiful stories. I'm now teaching literature myself, and I tell my students that same thing." Destiny sat in her usual chair by the bed, watching as Dr. Richardson shared more letters. Each one was a testament to the lives she had touched, the students she had inspired, the wisdom she had shared. It was like watching someone piece together a broken mirror, each letter reflecting back a part of who she used to be. But it wasn't just Dr. Richardson who was changing. The local news picked up the story, focusing not just on the missing professor found, but on the young barista whose simple acts of kindness had helped bring her back. The coverage sparked conversations about mental health, homelessness, and the importance of seeing the humanity in every person. One afternoon, Destiny's mom came to visit Dr. Richardson in the hospital. She brought homemade soup and fresh cornbread, saying, "Anyone who looks out for my baby girl is family to me." The two women talked for hours while Destiny sat quietly, watching her two worlds blend together in ways she never expected. Dr. Chen and the university committee had been meeting regularly, trying to figure out how to help Dr. Richardson transition back to life. They offered her old position back, but she surprised everyone with her response. "I can't go back to who I was," she said firmly. "But maybe I can go forward as who I am now." She looked at Destiny with that familiar, thoughtful expression. "These past few years on the streets, they taught me things no classroom ever could. About survival, yes, but more importantly, about humanity. About how people look away from what makes them uncomfortable, and how a simple act of kindness can save someone's life." The hospital social worker had been helping Dr. Richardson process her grief in healthier ways. Together, they had visited Thomas's grave for the first time since the funeral. Destiny went along for support, holding Dr. Richardson's hand as she finally allowed herself to say goodbye to her son properly. "He would have liked you," Dr. Richardson told Destiny afterward as they sat on a bench in the cemetery. "He had that same way of seeing people, really seeing them." As Dr. Richardson grew stronger, she started talking about her plans for the future. She didn't want to return to Berkeley, too many memories, but she had ideas about using her experience to help others. She spent hours talking with homeless advocacy groups, sharing her perspective as someone who had lived on both sides of the situation. One day, a surprise visitor arrived at the hospital, Mr. Chen from the coffee shop. He brought flowers and an unexpected proposal. "The community center next to the shop has an empty space," he explained. "Maybe when you're better, you could use it. For teaching, for helping others, whatever you think is needed." Dr. Richardson's eyes lit up with that familiar spark Destiny had first noticed during their literary discussions. "A place where people can come to learn, to heal, to be seen," she mused. "Where being homeless doesn't make you invisible." The idea took root and grew. Local businesses, touched by the story, offered to help renovate the space. University colleagues promised to volunteer their time. Even some of the homeless people who used to gather near the coffee shop expressed interest in sharing their stories and skills. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was happening in the quiet moments, like when Dr. Richardson helped Destiny with her college application essays, sharing her decades of academic experience. Or when they talked about the future, not just Dr. Richardson's plans for the community center, but Destiny's dreams of college and beyond. "You know," Dr. Richardson said one evening as they looked through college brochures together, "sometimes life's greatest teachings come from its hardest chapters. 3 years ago, I lost my way because I couldn't see past my grief. But you found me, not just physically, but you found the part of me that was still alive, still capable of connecting with others. You reminded me that every person has value, has a story worth telling. Destiny thought about how different her mornings were now. No more early conversations on cardboard, but instead, these rich discussions in a warm hospital room. Yet the essence of their connection remained the same. Two people sharing stories, sharing hope, sharing the simple but profound understanding that everyone deserves to be seen and heard. As spring approached, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, both Destiny and Dr. Richardson stood on the threshold of change. Neither could have guessed that a simple cup of coffee and a conversation about books would lead to such transformation. But then again, the best stories often start in the most unexpected ways. The high school auditorium buzzed with excitement on graduation day. Sunlight streamed through the windows, creating a warm glow that matched the mood of celebration. Destiny sat among her classmates, her graduation cap decorated with a small quote from Pride and Prejudice, a tribute to where her journey had begun. In the audience, Dr. Richardson sat straight and proud, looking every bit the distinguished professor she once was. Next to her sat Destiny's mom, who had taken to bringing extra portions of Sunday dinner to Dr. Richardson's new apartment above the community center. The two women had formed their own special bond, united in their pride and love for Destiny. The past 6 months had brought changes that no one could have imagined that cold morning outside the coffee shop. The community center, now named The Bridge, had become a beacon of hope in the neighborhood. What started as a simple idea had grown into something extraordinary, a place where people experiencing homelessness could find not just basic services, but dignity, respect, and opportunities to rebuild their lives. Dr. Richardson had found her calling again, but in a different way. She still taught literature, but now her classroom included people from all walks of life. She led writing workshops where homeless individuals could tell their stories, hosted job training programs, and created a library filled with donated books. The coffee shop where it all began provided free beverages for the center's programs, with Mr. Chen himself often joining the book discussions. As the graduation ceremony progressed, Destiny thought about how much had changed. She was no longer just the girl who worked morning shifts at a coffee shop. Her college application essays, telling the story of her friendship with Ms. Eleanor, had caught the attention of several universities. But what happened next was something she never expected. The principal approached the podium with a special announcement. Before we continue with the diplomas, we have a guest speaker who requested a moment to share something with our graduates and their families. Dr. Eleanor Richardson, would you please come forward? Dr. Richardson walked to the stage with grace, her silver hair gleaming under the lights. Her voice, once so quiet during their early morning conversations, now filled the auditorium with strength and purpose. Many of you know my story, she began. How I lost myself in grief, chose to live on the streets, and was found again through an act of kindness from one of your classmates. What you might not know is how that act of kindness has created ripples that continue to touch lives. She paused, her eyes finding Destiny in the crowd. Today, I'm honored to announce the establishment of the Acts of Kindness Scholarship Foundation. This foundation will provide full college scholarships to students who demonstrate extraordinary compassion and service to others, and our first recipient is the young woman who taught me that sometimes the person doing the saving is also being saved, Destiny Williams. The auditorium erupted in applause. Destiny felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she realized what this meant. Her dream of college was no longer just a dream. But Dr. Richardson wasn't finished. This scholarship isn't just about money for education, she continued. It's about recognizing that the smallest acts of kindness can change lives in the biggest ways. Since our story was shared, we've received donations and support from people all over the country. The foundation will not only provide scholarships, but will also continue to fund the Bridge and help establish similar centers in other communities. After the ceremony, amid the hugs and tears, Destiny found herself back where it all began, outside the coffee shop. But this time she wasn't alone. Dr. Richardson stood beside her, along with her mom, Mr. Chen, and several people from the Bridge who had come to celebrate. It had become a reminder that every person has value, every story matters, and sometimes the smallest actions can start the biggest changes. As she looked forward to college and beyond, Destiny knew that she would carry this lesson with her always. that in a world where it's easy to look away, the bravest thing we can do is to see each other, really see each other, and reach out with kindness. You know what I've learned? Dr. Richardson said softly, looking at the spot where she used to sit. Sometimes we think we're the ones giving help, but really, we're the ones being helped. When you brought me that first cup of coffee, you weren't just being kind to a homeless woman, you were helping me find my way back to myself. Destiny looked around at the small crowd gathered there, her mom chatting with a former homeless man who now worked at the bridge, Mr. Chen discussing book recommendations with one of Dr. Richardson's writing workshop participants, new friendships forming across boundaries that once seemed impossible to cross. I just saw someone who looked like they needed a friend, Destiny said simply. And that's exactly why this scholarship had to begin with you, Dr. Richardson replied. Because you understand that change doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from a simple cup of coffee, a conversation about books, or just taking the time to see someone when the rest of the world is looking away. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Destiny realized that this wasn't really an ending, it was a beginning. The story that started with an act of kindness had grown into something bigger than herself, bigger than Dr. Richardson, bigger than their weekly poetry discussions on cold mornings.